What's happening, everybody? Welcome to the channel. If you've never been here before, please check out the content. Hit the subscribe button, hit the share button, hit the like button. Check out some of the stuff that I have. Everybody else, welcome back. We're going to be talking about solitary confinement today. There's so much talk about what is called the Halt Act. And what the Halt Act actually is something that suspends the use of solitary confinement for more than 15 days. But let me clarify something about this act itself. It does not suspend solitary confinement or the use of solitary confinement. As I said, it suspends someone from being in solitary confinement more than 15 days. But there are also exceptions to that rule. If after 15 days a prisoner is still a danger and unruly, there are other methods to place that inmate in segregated areas and also extend solitary confinement. The correctional officers do not like, first of all, that law was not just created by New York State. That law was created from a think tank from people all over the country and even countries outside of the United States who came to the determination that long-term solitary confinement causes a lot of damage in very areas that we're going to get into, mentally, emotionally, physically, and it became a human rights issue. And because of this human rights issue, when it got dropped on the desk of the United States Senate, they ruled that what they should put it into effect, what other countries have put into effect many years ago. The officers are against this. Most officers are against this because solitary confinement is something that they use to keep the prison population in control. You know, they feel that their lives are in danger if they can't separate someone who poses that danger for an extended period of time. And of course, they have a legitimate argument, which I'm going to get into both sides of the story. Because if you have a prisoner who's running around stabbing someone, running around assaulting staff, let's say a prisoner who set someone on fire, how is 15 days in solitary confinement going to be enough? You understand? And then it puts the officers in danger. I've experienced solitary several times during my incarceration, and I will get into that as well. And for me, it was absolute torture. You know, for me, solitary confinement, because I'm naturally a hyper person and because I had underlying mental health issues since I was a kid, solitary confinement for me was truly torture. I was seconds away from suicide when I was in solitary. Um, I remember when they brought me in there, the way that I was brought in there, of course, was very aggressively. They talked to me very aggressively. They handled me very aggressively. And in my case, I'll give you an example. One of the times that I was put in solitary was for throwing one punch at someone. Someone who literally backed me into a corner, another prisoner who backed me into a corner and left me no choice but to really defend myself. And because I threw one punch, they were now sentencing me to solitary confinement, shipping me out of the jail I was in, taking me to a place called Ulster Box, which was in Ulster, New York, Ulster County, New York. It was a prison that was just a solitary confinement prison. And when they finished verbally abusing me and physically abusing me, the officers, and stripping me, and they opened the door to the solitary room and pushed me in this room that was absolutely horrific. The room was about 9 foot by 10 foot. It was filthy. There were blood stains and snot stains on the wall and the floor. The stainless steel toilet was deplorable. The mattress was very thin. The room was absolutely freezing. The light was on 24 hours a day. And when the door shut, I was trapped in this room with the echo coming off of the wall and the echoes of other prisoners who were screaming. And I was told that there was no talking in the Ulster County box, that I was to remain in silence. And so I was now trapped in this cold, bright, freezing, filthy room and told not to speak. And that's when the torture began. You know, right away I began having a severe anxiety attack to the point where I felt I was going to drop dead of a heart attack. Um, and I started to search for methods to calm myself down because I was panicking. And so I said, let me try to do yoga. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't concentrate. I couldn't get my mind there. Let me try to meditate. Let me try to pray. I got down on my knees and tried to pray, but then I would jump up out of anxiety, sweating and shaking and pacing back and forth in this little space. I started to pull my hair out. I started to pinch my skin, and eventually I had to scream for the help of the officer, and who showed up at the door and told me that I better shut my mouth and keep my mouth shut. Otherwise, they were going to come inside of the cell and beat me. Um, and I started to think of suicide. I started to talk to my family in my head. I started to say goodbye to them. I started to ask someone to come save me. In my mind, I started to talk to myself. I was panicking. I was freaking out. And I don't know how this went on all night. You can't tell if it was night or day either. And I finally would fall asleep, but I would sleep for 30 minutes, 40 minutes, and then pop back up, not knowing what time it was. And the panic would start all over again. And I was being tortured in there, and I was becoming suicidal. It was a true nightmare for me. I started to claw at my own skin. I started to feel pain and to feel alive. I started to bang my head off the wall. I started to punch the floor. I was freaking out in there, and it's something that I can never explain. All these years later, I've been home for 12 years, and my time in solitary confinement affects me till this day. My time in solitary confinement hurt me mentally and emotionally. Till this very day, I still suffer. I still suffer nightmares. I still suffer panic attacks. I still suffer the fear and the belief that I'm going to be put back in there. Even though I live a perfectly legal and normal life, I live with the fear of being placed back in solitary confinement. And I know I would take my life before I ever allowed that to happen again. It doesn't really matter how physically strong you are when you get put into solitary, because there is a mental torture there's no human contact. There's just a great deal involved. I'm going to play you a little video, just to give you a little understanding about some of the things that solitary confinement can do to you.
If you talk to people who are in solitary confinement for any length of time, almost all of them will say they have huge problems sleeping. They have massive anxiety, often panic attacks. They have trouble with memory and concentration. A lot of people tell me they can't read because they forget what they read a page before. People have thinking disorders, often paranoia. So if you hear some officers down the tier laughing and making crude jokes, and you think they're going to come in here and beat me up or kill me, there's nothing you can do with that thought. There's no way to check out whether it's real or not. So it just grows in your consciousness. And I think that's where the paranoia comes from. Despair is huge. You don't know whether it's night or day. And often there's lights on in the middle of the night. So you really lose your sense of time. There's no clock, there's no calendar. And what happens is you develop the sense, I'm never going to get out of here. They're going to kill me. I'm going to die here. And there's a despair that comes of that. And then suicide. Suicide is a huge problem in prison. The general rate of suicide in prison is at least twice as much as in the community at large. But, and this is a stunning statistic, about 50%, actually in Oregon, it's been reported as 60% of successful suicides where the person dies occur among the 3 or 5 or 7% of the prison population who are in solitary confinement. So that's a statistical proof of causality. Solitary causes suicide. Not in everybody, but the rate is just extraordinary.
Warning, incoming transmission.
Solitary confinement is toxic to mental function. There's a particular illness that results from being in solitary confinement. It's a delirium. It's a neuropsychiatric, almost a medical, a neurologic disease. What we see in humans, we see it in animals, we see it in mammals.
Now, suppose that in addition to an environment that is merely strange, we produce one that's really frightening.
Dr. Harry Harlow in the 1950s did some experimentation with monkeys, studying the effect of social isolation. And one of his experiments involved taking monkeys who had been raised with other monkeys, so they were socialized and okay, and then putting them in what was amounted to a solitary confinement chamber.
Distressed. He may die for want of love.
You'd see them rocking and shaking and sort of ritualistic, compulsive behavior. And after some period of time, they brought them out and put them into a cage with other animals. These monkeys were massively impaired. They were frightened, hiding. And then they would have sudden aggression, attacking each other. Very different behavior, very abnormal behavior. There was no recovery. These animals didn't recover from this. One of the important clinical findings with solitary confinement is that people deprived of an adequate level of stimulation become actually intolerant of stimulation. They overreact, they become hyper-responsive to it, and they can't stand it. That's why you see guys getting out of solitary and they just hide in their room, they just can't stand stimulation. There has been a recent study that actually showed that this is a reality in the brain. It was a study from the Balkan conflict in which it looked at prisoners released from confinement and looked at their brainwaves. Some of these guys had hyper-responsive reactions, spike reactions to a visual stimulus, and they looked at who those fellows were. Semi-starvation? No. Length of time in prison? No. Beatings? No. There was only two things that predicted it. Head trauma to the point of unconsciousness, and a period of time in solitary confinement.
As you see, those talk about the mental effects that the mental and emotional effects that can happen to someone. You know, you suffer a great depression. It can cause great depression inside of you, as the video just explained. It can cause severe anxiety, severe panic attacks, and these are life lasting. So, what can we do to change solitary? Because the officers have it. You can't just say that you're not going to have solitary confinement inside a prison. As much as it tortured me, as much as it almost made me even commit suicide, I am still under the belief that it is needed in some circumstances, right? I do believe that the officers have too much carte blanche on to issue solitary to prisoners. It shouldn't be up to a correctional officer to determine who goes in and who goes out. And so what is the solution if the correctional officer doesn't determine that? I believe the solution is an outside entity that comes in to handle the disciplinary hearing. I do not believe a employee for the New York State Department of Corrections, giving New York as an example, should be in charge of the repercussions for disciplinary hearings. It should be a civilian that comes in to make the determination on what the punishment should be. And that they do have some civilians run disciplinary hearings in the prison. But those civilians have a very strong relationship with the correctional officers, and many times they take the recommendation of the correctional officer on what to do. So I think once a prisoner is at a disciplinary hearing and all the facts are being put forth on what he's being accused of or what he's guilty of, that ultimately a civilian should make the decision and on what the repercussions should be, and that civilians should not be employed by the Department of Corrections. It needs to be an outside entity. That's one thing that I believe. Um, you must, I think that solitary confinement should only be used for violent offenders. That's first of all. If you have someone who is assaulting staff, if you have someone that is stabbing someone, if you have someone that is cutting someone, using a weapon or using razors, if you have someone who is committing the act of arson in prison, if you have someone who is throwing bodily fluids on officers, if they're throwing feces, or these individuals must be removed from the general population. You cannot allow individuals who are and this includes gang fights either. If they have proof and they can determine that someone is in a gang and that they are attacking people in a gang, that they should also need to be removed from the population, because then they are torturing the other prisoners and torturing the staff as well. And you can't allow that. So you must have solitary confinement for those individuals. When there's a regular fight, which is a violent act. I think that a regular fight that is one-on-one between two prisoners, I think before you place both of them in solitary confinement, that there needs to be a very in-depth investigation into that fight to determine who instigated the fight. Because let's say one prisoner is attacked and the officers come and break up the fight, and they're going to put the prisoner that was attacked in solitary. How is that justifiable? How is that fair? If the other person was the aggressor and the other person was the instigator, the person was attacked should not be placed in solitary confinement. And there are other options for him. Things like long-term keep lock, which is where you get placed in your cell, locked in your cell, but you're not isolated from human contact and from the population. So things need to be really looked at from a different perspective in the way that solitary confinement is used altogether. I don't believe there should be any solitary use. There should be no solitary for nonviolent offenses, right? Solitary is when someone gets caught with a tattoo gun, when someone gets caught trying to smuggle some contraband, when someone gets caught refusing a direct order, when someone refuses to go to program, when someone gets caught with drugs, with narcotics. I don't believe solitary confinement should be used for those things, right? Because solitary confinement is really designed, or should be designed, to remove the threat, someone who is a threat, from the general population. Solitary confinement should be used to remove people who are endangering staff and other prisoners. Then they should be removed from the population and placed inside of solitary confinement. Okay? This way everyone else is kept safe. You can't have someone making the environment dangerous. And people that are nonviolent, people that are getting caught with narcotics, refusing to go to programs, or one of countless offenses, getting caught with a tattoo gun, those people are not a threat or a danger to the prison staff or the prison population, and they should not be placed in solitary confinement. Because solitary confinement is torture. It is a form of torture. The way it sits right now, it is a form of torture. And I'm going to give you some ideas of the things that they need to change as in regards to how solitary confinement is designed. Right. One of the things that they can do to stop solitary confinement from being torture is to have bars instead of doors. See, when you go into solitary confinement in 90% of the places, it's a door that shuts, and it's a solid door, so you can't. Your sensory perception is completely thrown off, which can drive someone mad. In other words, you could only hear echoes, and you can't really hear words or sounds. You can't get any natural light. You can't see other human beings walking by. There's no human contact at all, right? And so the door really turns it into torture instead of solitary, right? And this is not a liberal form of thinking. Please don't think that if I was liberal, I would tell you that I don't think solitary confinement should exist. I'm more of a conservative thinker, believe it or not. But I don't, even as a conservative, I don't believe in torture. And even if someone stabs a prisoner, right? Let's say one prisoner stabs another prisoner. I don't believe you torture that prison. I don't believe you torture the prison for that. I believe you have to segregate him. I believe you have to remove him from the general population. I believe that he should be put in solitary, but I don't believe he should be tortured, right? Because then the people in authority become the torturers, okay? And they're just as bad as the person that committed the offense. 15 days, the time limit. If someone stabs another prisoner, is 15 days enough? Probably not, right? But you can't leave them in solitary confinement for a year or even 6 months, right? And so what you do is let's say you have a 30-day maximum punishment in solitary confinement. You could extend it to more than 30 days if you make these changes that I'm going to suggest. They need to have access to their own light switch. When you go into solitary confinement, a lot of places leave the light on 24 hours a day. That is a form of torture because you can't sleep. You don't know if it's morning. You don't know if it's night, right? And there's no light switch in the cell. The officers control the light switch from their office, or from outside the cell. So a prisoner should really have access to his own light switch. This way, when he wants to go to sleep, he can shut the light, right? They should have a limited commissary buy. And again, this is not a reward for being in solitary. What I'm saying is that the nutrition that a person in solitary confinement receives is very minimal. If according to law, you have to have 2,000 calories a day, that's exactly what the prison is giving you, 2,000 calories a day. And some of these guys are 200 pounds, 220 pounds, and they have muscle on their body. And you're just giving them, you can't give them the proper nutrition. They start to deteriorate. And so I think they should be allowed to order commissary. And it can be a limited commissary buy, not the same commissary buy that someone in the general population is entitled to, but a limited commissary buy where they can at least buy themselves some snacks and buy themselves some extra food, right? This way they have that to depend on their nourishment after they eat the prison meals. If they're still hungry, they have a little food. If you want to leave a guy in the cell starving, it becomes torture, and you are starving off of the food that they give you in solitary confinement. It's not enough for a man to sustain himself, and it's not just going to hurt him physically, it's going to hurt him mentally and emotionally if he doesn't receive the proper nutrition. I believe that someone in solitary should be allowed to have a radio that works with headphones, not a radio that plays out loud so he can disturb people in the solitary confinement unit or blast his radio, but a small Walkman type of radio, just an AM FM radio, so he can put on his headphones and listen to music. Music does wonders. Music can help people find some peace. Music can help people relax. Remember, it's not about rewarding them. You have removed the threat from the general population. You have removed the danger from the general population. So giving him a radio in there to keep him at peace is something to stop him from going mad, to stop the person in solitary confinement from going mad, because we don't want it to be torture. We just want to keep everybody safe. It's not about torturing the person, okay? He needs to have daily access to someone from the mental health department. when you're in solitary, they do have people from the mental health department come around, but it's someone needs to come around every day. There needs to be therapists or social workers uh, designated to solitary confinement only, and they have an office in the solitary confinement area, and they spend their days speaking with the men in solitary confinement to make sure that they're okay, that they're not becoming suicidal, that they're not harming themselves, right? And that there's still a little human interaction there. According to law, a person in solitary confinement is allowed to have 60 minutes of recreation every day outside of that cell. Well, what that has turned to is taking them and putting them into what is called the dog cage. So you're taken out of your solitary confinement cell and you're putting them outside into what's relevant to a dog cage, an 8x9 cage where a lot of them don't even get to see sunlight. And that's not the proper form of recreation. They need to go into a recreational yard where there's a basketball, where there's a handball, where there's a few weights, and they can go outside and stimulate their bodies for that 1 hour a day. So solitary confinement areas need to have a recreational yard where they can get out and stop themselves from deteriorating. These aren't rewards. The prisoner is still removed from the population. He's not allowed to hang out with any other prisoners. He's not allowed to get a normal commissary buy. He's not allowed to have all the property he would normally have in the general population. And he's segregated in his own cell. So he's still being punished, even though we'd be allowed to give him these things right there, right? They need to have, I said with the commissary buy, they should be able to get a nutritional drink, like a protein drink. At least once a day, they should be able to receive a protein drink inside of solitary confinement to keep their nourishment. And they need to have access to proper literature. They need to have access to books, which they do now. They do have access to books and magazines, but they need to have access to books and literature, and the book and literature needs to be handed out to them. Beneficial literature, like literature on living right, literature on proper morals and values, literature on the dangers and the result of consequences when you don't behave yourself. They need to get some psychology literature to really understand, why what's happening to them is happening to them and what happens to them when they make the wrong choices and decisions. Gang members. The gang members, I believe that the Department of Corrections needs to take a different outlook on gang members. And what I mean by that is that if someone is declared that they're in a gang, pardon me, let me take a little sip of my Snapple. If it is proven that someone is participating in a gang inside a prison, which is many of them, I believe that they should be shipped out of that prison and they should have a prison for the gang members. And then they say, well, that would make that prison very dangerous. If we put all the gang members in one prison, that makes them very dangerous. Well, maybe if you don't want to put them in their own prison, then they need to have their own area in the prison. All right. And that area of the prison needs to run differently than the general population. Right. It needs to be more strict. You can't have gang members are what upsets the prison population mostly. The gang members are what cause the majority of problems inside a prison. This is true. And there needs to be a way that when they declare and identify someone as being in a gang, that he is taken out of the general population and either sent to a prison that handles them specially or sent to a different area in the prison, because something needs to be coordinated in that area right there. Their prisons could be run more like a boot camp. You might have to run those prisons more like a boot camp, more like a military. Attica is a good example. I did 6-7 years in Attica prison, and Attica prison runs their prison much stricter than other prisons inside of New York State. Out of the 40 prisons, Attica runs theirs more like a boot camp and more like a military. And there aren't as much day-to-day problems in Attica because of the strictness of the prison. And so I believe that's a big issue. Outside of solitary confinement, as the governor of New York, Kathy Hochul, is doing, they need to put the body cameras on the correctional officers. Correctional officers, all of them, need to be wearing body cameras. She just approved $18.4 million for that in the state budget, and another $400 million for cameras within the facility. This really needs to stop. This really needs to start to stop the abuse that comes from the handful of officers that are very abusive. Cameras do save lives. Cameras stop a lot. As we saw in Robert Brooks' case, they only went through with that beating and beat Robert to death because they believed that a camera wasn't on. And, so the camera also helps with repercussions. Obviously, if they do something, it's able to see. Cameras help everyone. If officers make the statement that prisoners are attacking them, prisoners are throwing feces on them, then as an officer, I would want to have a camera too, so I can show that to the public, show what I have to deal with every day as an officer. And from the prisoner's argument that officers are abusive and beating them, I would want to be able to show that to the public as well. And so cameras are a big answer in the system and really needs to be done. The prisons itself need to run a little stricter. And this is coming from, someone who spent 17 years straight in prison. Prisons need to run stricter. In other words, as I said, more like a boot camp. Prisoners should be forced to tuck their shirts in. Prisoners should be not permitted to speak in the hallways when they're going from one place to another. Prisoners should be taught to march online in silence when they're going from point A to point B, like a military. You understand? Because we need to put discipline in these men. This is not to just discipline, this is not to just discipline them while they're in prison. It's a discipline that they'll bring with them back into the free world, and which will only benefit them. As far as officers, the officers that work in back to solitary confinement, officers that work in solitary confinement need some special training. They need to have training to deal specifically with men who are in solitary confinement. They need to be taught what signs to look for of mental and emotional breakdown inside of the prisoners. They need to be taught what someone's physical breakdown looks like. And it's not just sitting them in a 15-minute class. They should have to go to school for a month, or two, and really learn about what solitary confinement does to someone mentally, what it does to them emotionally, what it does to them physically, and the signs of physical decompensation in someone. Officers need to be trained in that. The officers that work in solitary confinement, that should be their post every day. So when one day they work in solitary, the next day they work in the guard tower is no good. These men should be specifically trained to work in the solitary unit and taught what to look for. There needs to be some higher education requirements for correctional officers to stop the problems in the prison system. A high school diploma is not enough. They need to at least get a 2 years associate's degree, and this is before they're even allowed to enter the academy, the Correctional Officer Training Academy. It should be required that they have a 2-year associate degree in criminal justice, in social work, in some type of psychology and human behavior. This will also make a difference in there. They are not taught this when they go to the academy. They are not taught this. They're taught how to use weapons. They're taught self-defense. They're taught things like that. And they really need to be taught more on the human interaction. Solitary confinement causes a lot of problems inside of people. Going back to solitary, it causes a lot of paranoia that'll stick with me for the rest of my life. It causes people to do self-harm. It causes a psychosis inside of people. It causes permanent damage inside of people mentally, where they start to talk to themselves. They start to deteriorate. They start to break down. They lose trust in human nature and human beings. So, although I believe it's a tool that is necessary. It's a tool that is necessary. We have to be very careful on how we use it. We have to be very careful on how long we use it for, because it causes permanent PTSD, post traumatic stress syndrome. And there's the argument that people will say, well, then stay out of prison and don't go to jail. And when you're in jail, don't misbehave and you won't end up in solitary confinement. It's easier said than done. Okay. People make mistakes in life. All right. And just because you may not have made the mistakes on the severity of others doesn't mean that they should be tortured when they go into the prison system. And the ones that are in the prison system and still continue to misbehave, yes, there needs to be repercussions. I believe in that. Right. But as authority, as the Correctional Department of Corrections being responsible for the care, custody, and control of prisoners, they should not become an abuser. Okay. And many things need to be changed. It's very, very unfortunate that it's not a simple solution. But I will say that I have been home from prison for 12 years. And the times that I was in solitary confinement, I was put in there unjustly. I didn't deserve to be put in solitary confinement, and it was used abusively in my case. It was taken advantage of in my case, and I was locked in that room screaming for help that never came. So hopefully a solution could be reached. Let me wrap this up, and I hope you guys learned a little something about the solitary system and some things that we can do to make a change. You guys be well.